Well, good evening, everybody. Well, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Bill Tyler, the curator of the Historical Society, and we hope you enjoy this presentation about the Bible printing industry in Lunenburg. As a bit of background, I spent the entirety of my 45-year working career in the commercial printing business. One thing I did want to point out that some of you may have noticed this individual right here, that tortured expression on his face. I can relate to that because I had the same expression many times in the printing business. Before we begin on the Lunenburg part of it, I thought it would be helpful to explain some of the basics of the printing process and how it evolved over the years, which eventually led to Lunenburg's contribution to the Bible printing and bookbinding business. All right, this first slide, there's a kind of misconception that, well, the name of the program was Gutenberg to Lunenburg. I'm sure most of you are familiar who Gutenberg was, but there's a misconception that they thought he was the first person to ever put ink to paper, but that's not the case. The Chinese are credited with creating hand-carved type on wood blocks, such as up on the screen, with the wood blocks on the right and the resulting print on the left. The ink was made from soot and other charred material, and was applied to the form of type and pressed onto the paper. Movable clay type replaced the woodblock type at about 970 AD in China. The first version of this type involved carving individual letters into clay blocks and baking them. This block type was arranged on a clay frame, which was then manually pressed onto the paper. As you can see in this one, the type is all movable, so they can actually set a form of type to however they want it. The process of using woodblock type that was movable made a comeback in 1297 AD, when the Chinese developed a method of making the type more precise, and it was also more durable than the clay type. They also created a revolving table that the typesetters were able to use to organize the type more efficiently. Johannes Gutenberg was a German inventor who introduced letterpress printing to Europe with his movable metal type printing press. His many contributions to the evolution of printing include the invention of a process to mass produce this metal type, the use of oil-based ink, and the invention of the printing press itself. This is a replica of the press that Gutenberg invented that is located in Carson, California at the International Printing Museum, and is based on the press that is in the Gutenberg Museum in Germany. And you'll see in a few minutes that the presses of the 19th century were very, very similar in design. Gutenberg was the first to create his type pieces made from an alloy of lead and tin. His wooden press design would reign for over 300 years before anything significantly changed in the process of putting ink on paper. This is a diagram showing the components of his press. Movable type was arranged in a wooden plate called a lower platen, right here. And a sheet of paper was laid on top of it. And this upper platen was screwed down by this horizontal lever, would turn the screw down, and would create the impression on the paper. And on the side, there's some leather balls that are stuffed with hair, and they used to ink the type. Again, it's a very, very basic, simple design. In 1452, Gutenberg produced the one book to come out of his shop, the Gutenberg Bible. It's estimated that he printed 180 copies of the 1,300-page Bible. Unfortunately for us, his Bible is not among the Bibles that are up there. We hope they would be, but unfortunately not. It is known as the earliest major book printed using mass-produced metal type in Europe. This is the first press that was brought to America in 1639. It was set up in Cambridge, Mass., and the press remained in continuous use for 150 years, printing some of the first books of the New World, including the Bay Psalm book. And you can see in this, even in 1639, that press is nearly identical to what Gutenberg invented. There really is no difference to it. There's an image of two different presses in the 19th century. And the machinery still hadn't changed in the basics. You can see by the side-to-side image of the two presses, the only difference is that the press on the right is made of iron and the one on the left is wood. But the process and the parts are all the same. You got the upper plate and lower plate, upper plate, lower plate. And they were both manually operated. And this press on the right was probably more indicative of what would have been in Lunenburg. It should be noted here, though, that prior to the American Revolution, there had been no printing or publication of the English Bible, as was illegal to do so. All demands for the Bible had to be met by importing them from England. This slide here, I added this one because I thought it was kind of interesting. When doing research for a program or any program for that matter, you always come across different things you weren't particularly looking for, but you find it interesting. John Baskerville printed this version of the Bible in 1763 while at Cambridge University. What I found interesting about it, at least to me, is that he was a devoted atheist. William Greenough came to Lunenburg with his family sometime before 1820 from Haverhill, Mass. He and his sons established themselves in a printing business at 125 Lancaster Avenue, which is on the corner of Lancaster Ave and what is now Rolling Acres Road. Which, by the way, became known as the Elmdale Farm, and the adjoining land would eventually become Rolling Acres Development. They printed only Bibles, and these were called the Polyglot Bibles, which refer to the editions of the Bible in which the text consists of translations in various languages arranged in parallel columns. This arrangement allowed scholars to compare ancient and modern versions, as well as to examine closely the translation from one language to another. This is the title page for one of the Bibles that are on the table up there. This is from the Greenough Bible, printed in Lunenburg in 1820. I want to point out a couple things on this page that might need to be defined. The word apocrypha comes from the Greek word meaning hidden or secret. The Apocrypha is a collection of books written in the 4 centuries between the Old and New Testaments. Though the Apocrypha is not scripture, many have found this collection useful historically. The other word on the top of the page, Collins Stereotype Edition, refers to the stereotype as a solid plate of metal type cast from a paper mache or plaster mold, taken from the surface of a form of movable type. So they would take the form of movable type and make a plaster cast of it. And then they would form a complete metal plate of that particular form. Setting type was a laborious process, and in the case of Bible printing, required a huge amount of metal type. Since the content of the pages didn't change, it made sense to have a permanent solid plate of the paper being printed. This process was done by a firm in New York. If ever anybody of you ever happens to go on Jeopardy, you can keep that in your mind. Maybe you'll solve that one if somebody asks you what it is. The Greenos also operated a type foundry at a nearby location for the production of metal type. As with presses, this process of making metal type remained virtually the same from when Gutenberg perfected it, well into the 19th century. Hot alloy metal was poured into these forms to form the type. This next slide is pretty interesting. It took me a long time to find anything that would even resemble what I'm about to talk about, but it's the Greenos press at Lancaster Ave was powered by a horse going round and round in a circle beneath the house in the cellar. So this particular slide is not as of a printing press. It's a mill of some sort, but as you can see, the horse is going around here and is turning this column, which turns this and turns that, and also it's also operating a sawmill at the same time down here. But like I said, I couldn't find anything related to the printing, but that gives you an idea of how it would work. When I read about this, I thought it might be just another local anecdotal story passed down from generation to generation. Then I came across this article from New York City about the Harper and Brothers firm, printing firm, which eventually would become Harper's Magazine. The following is quoted from that article, and I found it very amusing. In the early days at Cliff Street, at least by 1828, horsepower was added to manpower through the purchase of one of the new presses invented and manufactured by Daniel Treadwell of Boston. However, hand presses were not discarded. As late as 1837, 24 hand presses were still in use. The Treadwell press was connected by a system of gears to a vertical shaft which extended to the basement. A horizontal beam was then connected to the bottom of the shaft, and at the far end of the beam, a white draft horse was harnessed. As a horse walked steadily in a circular path, the shaft turned the gears upstairs, and the presses flapped away as fast as the sheets could be fed to them. In 1833, the new Adams steam press was invented, and the horse was retired to Father Harper's farm on Long Island. For a while, he frolicked around the pasture, enjoying his new freedom. Then old habits asserted themselves. When the 7 o'clock whistle blew, he emerged from the barn, went to a solitary tree in the pasture, and walked steadily around it till 12 o'clock whistle. Told him he might rest for lunch. When he took up his solitary and circular tramp until the 6 o'clock whistle released him for the night. Our records also indicate that this faithful horse that powered the Greeno press was given a Christian burial on the property with a stone slab marking the spot. I can't attest to that if it's still there or not, but it's kind of an interesting story anyway. Oops. In 1837, there were 16,000 books printed and bound in Lunenburg. Most were Bibles, but Gulliver's Travels and Robinson Crusoe were also among the books made here. When Colonel Cushing became more active in public duties, he sold his business to Charles Gaylord, who continued in business for 9 years, closing his doors in 1843. Wagons loaded with newly bound books went weekly or bi-weekly from Lunenburg to the large publishing firms in Boston. The team was led by a horse, followed by 2 pairs of oxen. Colonel Cushing employed a number in his bookbinding business. Some of these people lived with his family and others in their own homes. He also carried on bookbinding at the house on the southern corner of Lancaster and Whiting Street. After the Greenoughs left town in about 1830, Cushing added printing to his bookbinding business. That's the corner house there. A lot of people aren't used to what it used to look like, but it had a porch in the front, and it looks entirely different than it looks now. After the Bible printing business ended in Lunenburg in 1843, there were some other small printers in Lunenburg who printed newspapers such as the Autumn Leaves. We have a copy of that up on the table. Another humorous thing to me is that it seems in Lunenburg, and maybe that's the way it was any time in the 19th century, but it seemed like any work done back then involved a great deal of rum. It's even noted in records of costs associated with the building of town meeting houses. According to our records, a good supply of rum was brought back from Boston on those return trips. I thought to myself, it's a good thing it was on their way back, because otherwise, who knows where those Bibles would have been delivered to. I thought you might be curious to see what a modern printing press looks like. Ink is still being put on paper, but the method has changed greatly. Presses today can lay down multiple colors on both sides of a sheet of paper at speeds of over 20,000 sheets an hour. Ironically, this press is German-made and is still the hallmark of modern presses, 573 years after Gutenberg built his press. On a table up there, there's a small press. It's like a job press that someone would have had in their basement or garage or something to print like business cards and things like that. But it's identical to a much larger version. It's identical. It's just a smaller version of it. And basically, it's the same principle as the ones I showed you earlier, where there's no type in it right now, but that's where the type chase would go, the type form would go here. These rollers, when you press this lever down, these rollers would run up. This is where the ink was. The rollers would go up, hit the ink tray, come down and ink the type up. And the paper was here, and the last step would raise up and make an impression right there. A very simple process. Lever A was pushed down. So this concludes the part of the program on the history of the printing. We have some items up there that we can show you. I'd be happy to show you how that press operates if you're interested. Again, thank you for coming. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them if I can. If not, come on up and take a look at the... Oh, I'm sorry, Pat.
Can you go back to the Gutenberg page that you showed, which was 5 or 6 slides into the...
Of Gutenberg himself?
No, of the page of his
Bible?
Bible, yeah.
That one?
No?
Nope, that's not the right one. That's the one.
That one.
Yep.
When that page was done, and I guess the proper term is an illuminated manuscript, would that be an illuminated manuscript, or is that strictly handwritten manuscript work? Regardless.
Yeah.
The colored large G or E or whatever the letter is intended to be, how did they color that? And how did they color the red lettering? Was that all done in one process?
Probably not. Probably not. They probably did it separately. They probably did, you know, the text version, and they probably did that afterwards. That would be my guess.
Okay, and like the blue infill,
Yeah.
that may have been hand applied possibly?
It could have been. It could have been.
All right,
It could have been.
okay, thank you.
Yeah. So you want to come up? I can show people how this thing works if you like. Basically, what you would do, this is called a chase. And it's got typeset in here. And also the type is backwards, because if it was right facing, it would come out backwards. So it's backwards in the chase. So this would come down in here like this. I'm not going to put it in because it won't stay there. But basically, in this, there's supposed to be some rollers here. We don't. For some reason we don't have them on it. It didn't come with it. But when you press this down, it would come up and make an impression against the type. And every time this thing would spin with ink on it, and the rollers would come up, get ink on, go down, and make the next impression. Very simple process.
So the rollers are missing, is that?
The rollers are missing, I don't know. We have another one in the Historical Society, it's bigger than this, it's got rollers on it.
And what was that made?
I would say this one here was probably made in the 30s or 40s, something like that. It's not terribly old. But it's, like I said, it's the same. One of the places I worked had a large press like this, but it was powered, but it was the same thing, exactly the same principle. Again, we have a couple Bibles up here if you want to come up and take a look at them. We have a copy of the Autumn Leaves, and we also have some printing plates here. These are probably could be called stereotypes, but they're actually printing plates of the corner house. Before it was the corner house, it used to be it was called the corner house, but it was a restaurant. There's some printing plates up here, and there's also a map. So if you'd like to come up and take a look at it, and we thank you for coming.